Welcome again to The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and tonight with our panel of experts, we're going to be looking at very important issues. We'll also have an on-the-ground report from a demonstration in Annapolis, Maryland against police brutality. Stick with us, we'll be right back. On Martin Luther King's birthday, when movement activists from the Black Lives Matter movement in Baltimore went to the state capitol of Annapolis, Maryland, to demand legislation to address police brutality, the Global African was in the house.
The Global African is here at the Maryland State House, where activists are demanding legislation be put forward to address police brutality.
I was brutally beat at my home on July 1st, 2013, with my 3-year-old son in our van in front of 30 neighbors and witnesses at the time. I was beaten 18 days to be exact before Tyrone West was killed, all right? And I was beaten by two to three officers that brutally beat me, with two of the pursuing officers that stopped Tyrone with the traffic stop. Internal Affairs was called for my incident, and a proper investigation and transparency was conducted, then those officers would have been removed from the streets, and Tyrone West will be alive today.
We need to have the Officers' Bill of Rights disassembled. We need to tear it down. The Officers' Bill of Rights is what these officers that murdered my son hid behind. Their Bill of Rights, which gives them 10 days to get a lawyer, get their lives together, and then come forth with what happened. If I had murdered someone, day one, I would have been dragged in.
I mean, we're talking about the reform of the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. We're talking about strengthening the Civilian Review Board. We're talking about really looking into the development of an independent prosecutor or independent entity where those victims of injustice can find justice.
Well, I think the issue was abandoned, and I think that especially in the 80s was probably the decade when law enforcement severely began to change its practices and began kind of an attack, hyper-policing in certain communities of color, poor, impoverished, more impoverished neighborhoods and communities of color.
These actions come under the context of a national day of action that's taking place on the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr.
This protest falls right in line with where Dr. King would have been had he lived to this day. Protesting police brutality, protesting the way African American males in particular are being treated by the police. So it's significant that we're here today on his actual birthday to lift our voices together with a new generation of protest leaders.
Well, King's legacy has been watered down. A lot of people don't understand that King was someone who challenged all forms of injustice, all forms of institutional racism, white supremacy, militarism, challenged issues of poverty. So this demonstration is really in the spirit of Dr. King, his unrelenting spirit of challenging injustices wherever they are. If King was here, he would be standing with us, and that's the message we wanted to get across.
Dr. King be celebrating today? Would Dr. King, what would Dr. King do?
And for our discussion, we're joined by James Early, who is a board member of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Real News Network. We're also joined by Princess Black, a Washington, D.C. historian, librarian, and keen student of Black politics and culture on the African continent and in Black America. I want to welcome you both to the Global African.
Thank you.
So, is there an international, you're an activist in the Black Lives Matter movement. Is there an international aspect to this, or is there to that movement, or is that movement domestic?
It's building. It's building. A lot of people are working internationally, just not on a larger scale as we wish, but I think slowly we will filter and flourish over into those spaces because it's important, and we see the connections between here and Nigeria and Cameroon and Niger and even Paris, because there are Black people in Paris as well.
Right.
So I think one of the problems in our generation and what we're trying to do is garner more support, because it takes a lot of work and travel and all of those things to build those relationships. And a lot of us are under or unemployed, so we're working to build that collective where we can support each other into those spaces.
I would agree with Princess on this. I think a key responsibility of the younger generation of activists who are leading these movements is to begin to map where black people are and find the content. For example, on the issue of Black Lives Matter, Ferguson ran like a virus through the American continent. I got calls from Telesur in Brazil and Cuba and other places. And people are beginning to say, but look at the incarcerated in Brazil, look at the incarcerated in Cuba, look at them in Colombia, look at them throughout the Americans. They're disproportionately black and are indigenous. So they are making the connection.
I think we've had those connections in the past. When you look back at the Black Power movement, it was a global movement.
That's right.
It's just something that has been reduced down to leather jackets and afros here in our space. And people weren't thinking of, you know, that connection on a global level. When you look at like back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was the whole mugging thing going on. And that was a worldwide piece of propaganda about people of color being muggers. And they were using that to imprison us and trap us. And there were Black Power movements all over the world.
I think you're on to something here, because even with the Civil Rights Movement, let's remember, what became the freedom anthem of the entire world? We shall overcome. Solzhenitsyn and all of those people in Russia were, they appropriated that. And I think it is, as you point out, a matter of us reminding ourselves that not only do Black lives matter, but because we are in the heart of the so-called most powerful nation and the one who has done the most egregious things in the world, and who have also provided some extraordinary virtues and benefits to the world, that we're not just another black community. There's a particularity of living in the United States. It doesn't make us better, but it does raise the responsibility that we have, not to just look inward, but to take a responsibility outward vis-a-vis foreign policy, for example, the kind of things that when Trans-Africa Forum was actually functioning, when Bill was there and Randall Robinson, the founder, we really had ways in which that came through. The Institute of the Black World 21st Century, which is a new organization who brings together popular fronts, is beginning to look internationally as well on this issue of how to help convene and connect the diaspora. And Black Lives Matter is another one of those nodes in that expanding network.
There were these demonstrations, protests in Niger that were a response to the way that France responded to the killings in Paris. I'm interested in actually us talking about the killings in Paris and the global response. I'm sure that you join with me in condemning all forms of terrorism, but there was what I felt was missing from much of the discussion, certainly in the mainstream, was a real examination of the condition of people of African descent in France, whether they are Muslim or not, whether they're from North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. They are a sub-citizenry. And there wasn't a lot of discussion about that. I mean, this was simply painted in terms of religious fanaticism, which doesn't just happen with us. I mean, like Northern Ireland has often been treated as just religious fanaticism as opposed to a national liberation struggle. But this really struck me, that you have these populations in France that are and have been for generations treated like dogs. They are there, they're not just off the boat. They're very much a part of what it is in France, yet they are not treated as French. And so why should it actually surprise anybody that when you have certain kinds of provocative material that people are going to just go off?
Well, not only do we should condemn terrorism, I think we should be critical of any form of fanaticism.
Right.
Whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Marxism, any forms of dogmatism, any forms that close out the possibility of dialogue over what we think are legitimate differences we have. And of course, that's not what's being condemned. So that when missionaries went into Africa and tore people away from their culture, there is a psychological violence that comes out on that.
That's right.
And so, we have all of these colonial results of Africans in Europe now for hundreds of years. You see these black people in the Middle East who look like us, these sultans and whatnot, they look like us because they came out of the continent of Africa.
State of the Union address. I was struck in listening to it that Obama, in my opinion, continues to be the best mainstream political speaker out there. But that said, I mean, there were a number of things going through my head, right? I'm saying, well, it's not a terrible speech, but why wasn't it given 6 years ago?
First, middle-class economics means helping working families feel more secure in a world of constant change. It means helping folks afford childcare, college, health care, a home, retirement. And my budget will address each of these issues, lowering the taxes of working families and putting thousands of dollars back into their pockets each year.
And, you know, it's interesting that, I mean, the economy is improving in many respects, but for a lot of regular people, it's not. And there was no acknowledgement of that. And then it just sort of, you know, just kind of flew over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what did you think?
Well, first, I'll say that Obama never speaks to the underclass. His conversation is always centered around the middle class. And me personally, I'm from the E. Franklin Fraser School of Thought. I don't believe in the middle class. So these conversations that he's having, I'm trying to figure out who he's speaking to specifically, because for me, it's a mythical population of people. Most people that I know, including myself, and I have 3 jobs, the economy is not improving for me. Mm-hmm. Gas prices are down, but living in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, it costs more to ride the train than it does for a gallon of gas right now. So economy is not improving on my end. And to speak to your point that he is one of the greatest political speakers of my time and many times, he kind of reminds me of a preacher. He's a great orator, and so on Sunday he has many things to say, but throughout the rest of the week we're looking for him to show up, and he's not there.
Well, I think it's a really, first of all, I agree with your points, but I think it's a really deceptive proposition. This is a narrative about politics. It is not politics. It is really not, politics is about the negotiation of power that informs material circumstances of life, mm-hmm. and the uplift, the spiritual dimensions, the feel-good dimensions. But he is quite an orator. He is quite artful. The State of the Union is somewhat of a misnomer. We do want to talk about the nation as a whole, but if we don't talk about the disunion in the State of the Union, which he did not talk about, then we're following a narrative that they all use, a trope of the middle class, which both the Republicans speak to as well. But the fact of the matter is, we just had a recent report that 50% of public school children are living in poverty.
Right.
And so the index of democracy, that is ordinary people, participating, putting their imaginations, their voices about what the negotiation should be, we have left them out. We need to measure that by who are the least of us, whose voices are not in the conversation, whose aspirations are not in the conversations. So there are little literary tropes, if you will, for people to talk about the middle class, when the fact of the matter is Black America, the majority of Black America, while there are people like us on television and have cars and can move about, are going down.
Right.
Many in white America, that no one talks about the poverty
That's right.
and the disadvantage in white America. That does not exist.
One of the things that strikes me is that in Black America, I mean, I resent the kind of racist attacks on Obama that comes from the right and the birthers and the oathers and all that, right? But let's leave that aside for a second. In Black America, few of us stop and say, this guy is heading up a global capitalist empire. He is not there to represent us. He is a spokesperson for this global capitalist empire. And so I think it's important to put that and keep that on the table so that we are not treating this as a personal problem. In other words, It's not about whether Obama is a sellout or this or that. This is his role. This is the role in that institution. And that discussion needs to happen. And one example from the State of the Union address was about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, you know, it's like there's not a lot of people actually that know what this thing is.
Right. Right.
And the more that I have read about it, the more scared I get. Because I mean, really what this is it's essentially an authoritarian approach that will in fact completely turn any kind of political participation into a complete sham. Yet, you know, he's up there talking about, well, you know, there have been mistakes and problems with other trade agreements. Yeah, bud, but, you know, this was really bad.
Today, our businesses export more than ever, and exporters tend to pay their workers higher wages. But as we speak, China wants to write the rules for the world's fastest growing region. That would put our workers and our businesses at a disadvantage. Why would we let that happen? We should write those rules. We should level the playing field. That's why I'm asking both parties to give me trade promotion authority to protect American workers with strong new trade deals from Asia to Europe that aren't just free, but are also fair. It's the right thing to do.
I mean, I don't know, what do you guys think?
Well, for me, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the WikiLeaks dropped in February of 2011. So it's been out there bits and pieces for a few years. And I think the only people in America that are really concerned about it up until this point has been the American Library Association because of the specific piece with intellectual property. And
say something about that.
So there's many chapters in this, and none of them, like you said, we actually know what it entails in full. But there's a chapter on intellectual property, which is something that the American Library Association is very concerned about because it's vague. They're being negotiated privately. No one is really aware of what's going on. And they fear for how that may control our access to different information, cultural information. And when you use the word cultural, the first people that I think may be affected is Black people, people of African descent. And for me, as an activist, I'm kind of fearful of what that might mean if it goes through and how they may be able to censor us in that sphere, because a lot of the stuff that we're saying is pretty powerful, and America wouldn't allow us to say it if they could restrict that.
Absolutely, that's the way it feels, Jim.
You know, I was just thinking about the miseducation of the Negro, and Carter G. Woodson found in Black History. We might take off on that and talk about the miseducation of the American people. You know, what is the Trans-Pacific Pact? Well, underneath this represents a real changed power relationship in the world. I think 40% of the global economy is now coming out of the Pacific, and it will only increase. China holds the greatest reserve of US dollars in the world. China is trading both in dollars and its national currency, the yuan, as a parallel universe, anticipating that if another crisis comes, it will have some reserves to carry on the economy of production, distribution, consumption. Most of the American people, the educated American people, do not have a clue. This is about who will set the rules of the game in the already changed relationship in the economy. Now, of the 12 countries that are tied into the Trans-Pacific Pact, 8 of them already have bilateral relationships with China. So China has already outstripped the narrative, and we're being miseducated by the American press about what is actually going on.
This issue of the TPP goes even beyond what we're talking about here and has to do with a global reorganization of capitalism that is incredibly profound. But I'm interested in shifting a little bit to a discussion about the situation in Nigeria and this Boko Haram. I was struck by this massacre that they carried out, and it's happening at the same time as the killings in Paris. When it was 12 or 14 people killed in Paris, more than 1,000 people killed in northern Nigeria by Boko Haram. And the world's response to these two things was so dramatically different. I mean, what do we say about that? I mean, is this sort of a global example of Black Lives Don't Matter?
Exactly. It is, in fact, a prime example of how Black lives do not matter. And to speak to what you said earlier about how the right and left news are reporting these things, some news outlets have been saying that there's a lot less murders that have taken place in Nigeria, when in fact we know from local government there that there's been over 1,000. Yeah. So, there's these news sources that are, skewing our view of the situation, and then we're being bombarded with I am Charlie, and not I am Nigeria, when in fact we are, especially Black people here in America and around the world. And it is a global example of how Black lives do not matter.
Nigeria is a fractured state. I've been there maybe 2-3 times in the last 15 months. When you go to Nigeria and dealing with the upper classes, you see these families, these individuals rolling around in these big black brigades with these are private personnel. These are like private posses. Running people off the road. It is a very contentious, fractionalized so-called state. The north is mostly Muslim, then you've got various Hausa, you've got the Yoruba, you've got the history of the Civil War, the Igbo. We don't understand Nigeria because we're being, again, to run a trope, miseducated about what it is. And then there's the racialized nature of this sort of noblesse oblige that we see, that when Ebola or something breaks out, everybody help the poor Africans. So the U.S. goes there and builds a hospital that is basically empty because we got there at the end of the syndrome of Ebola, and it just sits there, but somehow the newspapers, particularly liberal and right-wing, want to convince us that we did the great humanitarian thing.
One aspect of that is, what is the future of Nigeria, right? But then there's this other question, which is a very different one, which is what has happened in the United States that African Americans are not really talking about Africa? I mean, we may mythologize Africa, we may adopt names and religions, but in terms of issues of policy and real solidarity, it's missing.
Well, from the bottom up, it is missing. I mean, the defeat of apartheid, one which drew a cross-class and multiracial alliance, people from different ideological perspectives, different political perspectives, because of the inhumanity of apartheid, really galvanized people. Once the nationalist victory was won, that humanity did not extend to now the corrupt nature of black leadership, who can no longer blame apartheid for what is going on. So that's one of the key factors. And then what do we mean by Black America in this part of the 21st century?
So essentially, we must find where we are in the world. We must identify with those people because we all have a connecting problem, and that's this institution of racism and this globalized system that's working really fast at the speed of lightning right now, in terms of grabbing and gripping our resources wherever they are, mainly in Africa. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. And in Black Lives Matter movement, what we're doing right now, people think we're quiet, we're educating ourselves. And so this is a real piece that we must tap into.
I want to thank you both very much for this discussion. It's wonderful. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll see you next time.